All right, welcome again everyone to this special edition of our new DNA attorney group. This month we're going to be talking about some new literature from NIST about mixture interpretation. This is called the Mixture Interpretation Foundation Review. So we have three things that we're hoping to do here. We want to talk to you about the Interpretation Foundation Review, the kind of main focus of this talk, because this is new for December 2024. And then we're also going to talk about two other papers that I want you to kind of be aware of. The first is a report that came out in 2016. This is called the PCAST report colloquially. It's the President's Council on, don't quote me on that, but it dealt with feature comparison, and some of the findings in the PCAST report are going to feed into what we talk about with regard to the Mixture Interpretation Review. Finally, we'll also talk about this History of Mixture Interpretation Supplement. This is a document that's attached to the Foundation Review, but is a really great place to start if you're new to understanding the history of mixtures. So it stands alone as a great document for learning. And in addition to familiarizing with the three papers I just mentioned, we'll also talk about how to navigate the mixture review paper based on what you need. So based on whether you're new to DNA, based on whether you are just looking for background, or whether you have a specific case that you are diving into. So that's where we're going today. And finally, I will abbreviate the name of this NIST DNA Mixture Interpretation Foundation Review to the MIFR, just for ease of conversation. So in addition to this paper that we'll talk about, there's another paper that came out in May of 2024 that deals with human interpretation and human factors. So another really in-depth look at issues related to DNA. Another big document that we don't have time to cover today, but please stay tuned. We're hoping to present that as a webinar during our monthly CRU series later in the spring. So please stay tuned. So let's do a little bit of background to prepare for where we're going. I mentioned the PCAST report. PCAST report looked at feature comparison methods. So that's when you're looking at a known thing and a question thing. So for the purposes of DNA, we're thinking of a crime scene profile compared to the profile of somebody we know, a standard. You might also think of fingerprints. Those are feature comparisons. The features of a known compared to the features of an unknown to see if they comport. So there were a number of feature comparison methods that were dealt with in this paper, and they looked at two issues. They looked at what's called foundational validity and also what's called validity as applied. Foundational validity is whether the underlying science can be applied appropriately, whether it can be replicated, whether the underlying foundations, that's where the word foundational comes from, are appropriate for the work. And then validity as applied only comes in if something has foundational validity. Validity as applied is how well are people applying the techniques and the things that were found in the foundational review to be appropriate. So one is about the science, one is about how the science is applied. And there were two parts of the PCAST report that dealt with DNA. One part dealt with single source mixtures and simple mixtures. So that's DNA that comes from one person or two people. And another part dealt with complex mixtures. Complex mixtures are when we're talking about mixtures of DNA that contain two or more people. And as DNA testing science becomes more sensitive, we're finding that more often we're getting complex mixtures in evidentiary samples. So in the PCAST report, when they discussed complex mixtures, so that's mixtures of more than two people, they looked at this idea of what's called eyeball interpretation, just using judgment and no other tools to figure out how a mixture should be resolved. They also talked about concern around a statistic called the CPI, the combined probability of inclusion. And these two issues together, they were concerned about the subjectivity of interpretation and also the consistency of interpretation across analysts. So you had different people in different places doing different things, such that if you gave the same work to different people, they were not coming up with the same answers. So PCAST was concerned about the work being done related to complex mixtures. PCAST found simply that eyeball interpretation of a complex mixture and an analyst calculated CPI, so this is not taking software into consideration, this is all hand calculation, this is not foundationally valid. It varies too much across people, we can't rely on it. What we know though is we have this new software to help us. We've all probably heard about probabilistic genotyping software. What's different about PG software is that they're using a different statistic. First, many things are different, but they're using a statistic called a continuous likelihood ratio. I'm going to explain this further in the talk, but something to consider is that when we're looking at mixtures now with PG, with probabilistic genotyping, we're looking at a different kind of calculation than we were looking at in these previous mixture analyses. The PCAST report also found that probabilistic genotyping has limitations. So this is what the report said in 2016. They were concerned about complex mixtures, but they pointed out that these techniques, PG techniques, have been validated in certain circumstances. And I've highlighted here what those circumstances are. You can dig more in, but this was the limit that PCAST was willing to put on this in 2016. We wanted mixtures of 3 individuals. We wanted there to be a certain minimum amount of DNA from each contributor. So limited application. So what's different? So what's different is that in this review, NIST is looking at all of the research, or as much as they could gather, that's been done on probabilistic genotyping and mixture interpretation since the PCAST report in 2016 to reevaluate the foundational validity of the current methods that are being used. Those methods include probabilistic genotyping, which you'll notice is a large focus of this report. So we only have 45 minutes today, so I cannot give you everything. I want to point out this webinar that John Butler, who is the main author of the report, put on in 2021. The report has been a long time coming. It's been in progress, and so in 2021, NIST allowed for a public comment period for folks to comment on a version of the report that wasn't final. This webinar dealt with that non-final version. So you're not getting an exact replica of the document that we're talking about today, but it's a really good place to begin to delve more into this document. And I've given you a little note here that if you really want to just dig into the chapter by chapter outline, start about 20 minutes in. So at this point, I'm going to take a quick pause because I can't see you with my slides running, and just see if anyone has a question. If you've got anything you want to ask, just go ahead and raise your hand. We don't have any questions in the room at this time, so I'm going to continue and talk about what a foundation review actually is. So in a foundation review, it's an examination of whether the underlying science is sound. We talked about this a little bit a minute ago with regard to the PCAST report. In the foundation review that has to do with mixtures, what we're talking about when we talk about underlying science is 2 things. We're talking about the DNA testing, so that's the actual DNA going into instruments, product coming out, but we're also talking about the interpretation of those results. And probabilistic genotyping is an attempt to interpret those results. So why do this now? Why do a foundation review now? What's different? So we've got a number of things that are different that makes this useful. So first, we know that DNA testing now is more sensitive than it's ever been. And we know that increase in sensitivity means we have more complicated results. More sensitive, you're picking up more data, you're going to have more mixtures, you're going to have more noise. So we know that the results we're getting now are more complicated than they were 20 years ago. So that sensitivity requires dealing with multiple levels of propositions. Propositions are the questions that we're asking about the evidence. So you can think of propositions in these 2 frames. One proposition is, whose DNA is this? Those are considered source and subsource propositions. Don't worry too much about the language, just think generally.
we're looking at the question of, could the person of interest have contributed the DNA or part of the DNA? So we're looking about who's in there. Another level of propositions deals with how did the DNA get there. These are activity level propositions. And again, don't worry about the language. Just think, is the DNA related to the crime or the action? So it's important to know what question we're asking. And this report deals with both of those questions. So that's another reason why now. And finally, because probabilistic genotyping software is the new standard. This is what we're doing if we're evaluating complex mixtures, and it requires this kind of rigorous review because it's been being used for a while now. I want to mention, on the previous slide, I mentioned propositions or questions that we're asking about the evidence. I want to flag this table in the MIFR. This is table 2.5 on page 56. This deals with the various proposition levels. Excuse me. And this chart can help you understand a little bit more deeply about what I mean when I say the questions we're asking about the evidence. So again, we're not going to go too deep in, but this is a place for you to dig more if it's useful to you. So we talked about why now. So what's the big deal with mixtures? Why is it so hard to deal with mixtures? These are a number of reasons. So the first is the number of contributors. There's more people in there. So those of us who've worked even a little bit with DNA know the basics, right? With STR testing, we get two numbers at each place. If you have more than two numbers, you probably have more than one contributor. So number of contributors, we're getting lots of data, lots of alleles in one locus, in one location. And we're also getting less DNA. So, like I mentioned earlier, more sensitive testing makes it so that we need less DNA to get a result. Because of that, less DNA is going in, you're getting less data that's not quite as quality out. So less DNA in, less you can say coming out. Additionally, when you have these complicated mixtures, when you have 3 people, 4 people, 5 people in a mixture, it's difficult to understand and assign individual pieces of data to the individual contributors to the mixture. So what that means practically is if you are looking at an electropherogram and you notice that there are a bunch of peaks in one place, and you know that you have 3 people, 4 people, 5 people in your mixture, it's difficult to determine whose numbers belong to whom. It's not obvious, and it's difficult to assess that. We also understand that there's degradation of DNA over time. A lot of us are working on really old cases. I talked to someone this week who was working on a case from the 1970s. So we don't necessarily have DNA in these perfect long chains that we had when the evidence was collected. We have degradation, smaller fragments of DNA. It's more difficult to pick that DNA, replicate it, and gather information from it, generate data from it. And finally, you have this issue of allelic overlap. What that means is that you might have people in your complex mixture who have the same alleles or kind of the same repeats at a location. And when you have that, it's difficult to kind of figure out, do you have one person that has this? Do you have multiple people that share this allele? Is the signal really high? So it's hard to piece that out. So these are just some of the challenges in mixture interpretation. If you want to go deeper, chapter 1 of the MIFR report is the place to go. So we know that we have complex mixtures, and it's not just one thing that's difficult with these mixtures. We have difficulties at 2 phases of the DNA testing process, you can consider it. We have issues at the measurement phase and issues at the interpretation phase. Measurement has to do with how well the technical instruments of DNA testing are working. So what you're getting as far as raw data coming out. Well, let's move on. Interpretation. So interpretation has to do with whether the conclusions that are drawn from measurement are appropriate. So to explain this a little bit better, we can look at this chart. So here on the left, all the way on the left, we see evidence sample, collection, storage, characterization. So that's picking something up from a crime scene. Moving forward, we have all of the wet work involved in DNA testing to gather the data. That's our measurement portion. So extracting the DNA, figuring out how much is there, making more of it, creating the electropharogram. And the end of the measurement process is that electropharogram, which you see linked down here. It looks like a multicolored graph. After you generate the electropharogram, you have another phase. That's the interpretation phase. That's using the electropharogram to understand the results. You might see this as a written report. You might also see this as an allele chart, where an analyst is going through and figuring out whether certain peaks are real data or whether they're noise. So this is a graphic way that you can understand this. I really like this chart too for teaching, especially if you are working to educate the court or someone else who's not quite understanding what you're trying to do with DNA testing, to work through the whole process and understand the DNA testing flow. So this is another great resource. This is figure 2.1 in the MIFR, page 35. So again, go back if you want more. This is one more image from the report that I want to mention. These are mixture interpretation steps. This is not new to the MIFR report. This has been something that the DNA community has recognized for a while. But this tells you a little bit more about what we're trying to accomplish in the interpretation phase of DNA. So when we get the electropharogram and we see that there are multiple alleles at one place, if they're more than 5, we know that there are probably more than 2 people in the mixture. And again, analysts has to go through and figure out, is that real data? Is that artifactual? How many people might be in here? How much DNA did each of them leave behind? Whose data belongs to who? Who might be included in these samples? And what's the stat associated with it? So it's not just one thing. Mixture interpretation actually encompasses all of these steps. So let's talk about stats. There are 2 kinds of statistics that have traditionally been used to deal with mixtures. Binary statistics ask just a yes or no question. Is the person of interest in the mixture or not in the mixture, right? You have to say a definitive yes or no. And those conclusions really only use the alleles that are located at any locus. They don't really use additional information from the electropharogram. But there's other stuff in there. We know, for example, you can measure the height of the peaks. You can measure the space of the peaks between the peaks. There's all of this other data, but binary stats don't take that data into account. Continuous statistics are looking for a ratio. They're not looking for a yes or no question. They're looking at the likelihood that the person of interest is in the mixture versus the likelihood that they're not. It's not a measurement, it's an estimate. And probabilistic genotyping software, most programs, report a likelihood ratio, and it's continuous, meaning they're taking this other information into account in the analysis. And the thing to remember about a continuous likelihood ratio is it's not one number. There's not a single correct likelihood ratio. If you have different analysts using different software, asking different questions, your likelihood ratio may change. So that's something I think to remember, is that you're not getting a single yes or no question, you're getting a continuum. So here's a place to stop and consider your own work. Are you currently working on a case where there's a mixture? Think more than 2 people. So do you have a case with a mixture of 3 or more people? How old is that case? Probabilistic genotyping software was really not used before the 2010s. And so if you have a case before then and somebody made an interpretation of a complex mixture, what kind of statistic was reported? Go back to what you've got and figure out, do you have appropriate work that was conducted based on what's in this report? And if you have an eyeball mixture with a statistic other than a likelihood ratio,
you might consider having that mixture reevaluated by an expert to see if what was done then comports with best practices now. So this is just one way that you can consider how this report might tie into your work. So this is another place where you can dig deeper if you want to. Table 2.2 on page 45 gives you different questions about the data and the appropriate statistic to use to answer that question and any requirements that are necessary in order to use that kind of statistic. So we're not going to dig in, but if you want to, especially if you have a case where this is appropriate, this is another place where you might be served to dig into the report. All right, we talked about chapter 1, we talked about chapter 2. Let's talk about what else is in here. This is a 6-chapter report with some appendices and attachments. Chapter 3 is the sources of data. They tell you everything that they collected to analyze to look at in chapters 4 and 5. Excuse me. In chapter 4, they look at, again, we talked about source levels. We talked about propositions. Chapter 4 looks at subsource level propositions. But again, don't worry about the language. Think about reliability of mixture interpretation. How correctly are we figuring out what data is in there and who the data belong to? Chapter 5, they're looking at activity level propositions. And again, think of this as relevance of the mixture interpretation. What does it mean if the mixture was interpreted a certain way? What does it mean relative to how it got there or when? All of those questions. And it's looking at whether there are appropriate studies that can inform how those conclusions might be reached. Finally, in chapter 6, potential and limitations of new technology. Something that in the 2021 webinar, John Butler mentioned a lot is that as they were working on this report, there kept being new literature released. And so it was difficult even at the time to keep up. So there's always new stuff. So think of this as a dynamic topic. So this is a lot. So where do you focus? If you are new to DNA in general, make sure you've seen our DNA 101 presentation. That is a great start. Once you have that, dig into the report. The executive summary of the MIFR will give you a focused look at what's in there and also help you understand if there are any other areas that you want to dig more deeply into. And then I really suggest for folks who are new, reading chapter 1 and 2 because the foundational principles there set you up for DNA work whether or not you're presently dealing with complex mixture issues. And I would specifically point people to the 16 principles of DNA. This is section 2.7 starting on page 57 of the report. If you don't have time to read everything, go to the summary, go to these 16 principles. What about if you need background on mixtures? You are already dangerous in basic DNA stuff, but you need to know a little bit more about this particular topic. At the top of the talk, I mentioned this supplement called The History of DNA Mixture Interpretation. In 21, when John Butler talked about this in the webinar, he mentioned that this was an addendum or an attachment to the report. As part of the review process, they decided to pull it out and make it its own report. So this stands on its own with great utility. Dig into this if you really want to get a good, strong background on how we got to where we are in the Mixture Foundation Review. Okay, what if you've been around for a while, you've got a specific case, you're here because you have got a mixture issue. So you're gonna have a little work to do. I suggest digging into all of the stuff that I already mentioned on the previous 2 slides, but also taking a deep dive into chapters 4 and 5, where they talk about source and with source level and activity level propositions.
That will help you understand how these issues can apply to the case at hand. I'd also suggest that you review a few more things. I mentioned this earlier in the talk, the hierarchy of propositions, the different questions that we're asking about evidence. If you're working on a specific case, you might look at that table, consider the questions that were asked about the evidence in your case, and then see if the appropriate statistics were applied. Other places to dig in are the references for additional literature. If you are writing something and you need background, if you are looking for additional folks to educate you, dig into these papers. Finally, the list of working group members. There is a list of experts who worked on this report, and if you were looking to engage an expert or otherwise talk to someone who's more deeply steeped in this, that list is a great place to begin searching. And finally, I am always here for you. So you can do all this, but also please contact the DNA team for a case consultation. And I will tell you how to do that. You can, oops, I missed a slide. I'll tell you how to do that in a second. Let's talk about one more thing. So how else can you use this report? Here are some ideas. The report came out in December of 2024. Is this new in your jurisdiction? Does this information satisfy any requirement to have something new to introduce to a court? That's for folks on this call to kind of turn over in their brains to see if there's a way you can use the date that this was released to help you in your work. You can also use the report as a litmus test. So I mentioned this already. If you've got an old case, compare what was done in that case to best practices as laid out in the report and see if you've got an agreement or a disagreement. It's also a great way to figure out how read up your expert is. If you're engaging an expert related to mixtures, you might ask them about this report and engage them on it to see what they know and how they can educate you more. Additionally, you can use the report for resources and reference. You can use the tables if you cite them properly. In your drafting, you can use the citations to pull additional literature for drafting. So even if you don't do anything with the actual text of the report, you've got a lot of meat here just for resource. And then finally, if you're looking for an expert, you can consider people who wrote papers or members of the working group who worked on this paper. And then of course you have the resources of the Quattrone Center at your disposal, both through case consultation and our continued consultation with experts. So that is everything that I wanted to present. I am going to stop our recording now and we will answer any questions.